The sun was just beginning to rise over the dew-covered wheat fields, casting long golden fingers of light across the wooden barn. The smell of wet earth mingled with something sweeter, the warm, spiced aroma drifting from a small stone building behind the house. Elias Stoltzfus, aged 38 from Amish community, stood at the entrance to his workshop, his plain black hat casting a shadow across his bearded face. His long-sleeved shirt clung to his back in the morning humidity. Around him, bees darted in and out, thousands of tiny wings working with silent, almost military precision. He dipped a wooden spoon into a clay jug. A dark, viscous mixture slowly flowed back down, forming a smooth thread. Elias muttered to himself in Pennsylvania Dutch German. "The purest thing the Lord gave us. But there's nothing pure about this war." Behind him, the distant rumble of engines grew louder. Not tractors, not wagons, airplanes. American B-17 bombers on a training flight, soaring low across the farmlands, headed for England, for Europe, for hell. Elias squinted up at the sky. He didn't wave. There was no one to wave to. Not anymore. His younger brother Isaac had shipped out to alternative civilian service last winter. No letters in weeks. The war felt like another world, one that had swallowed every able-bodied man and left farmers like Elias behind. With land, prayer, and silence. He reached for another jug when a low growl cut through the hum of bees. A military truck pulling up on the gravel path. Olive drab paint. United States Army markings. A soldier stepped out with a clipboard and a flat Pennsylvania accent. "Elias Stoltzfus?" "That's me," he answered cautiously. "You're on the list. We're requisitioning supplies for shipment to the 8th Army. Says here you've got 280 hives and stores of herbs. That right?" Elias hesitated. "That's right. But do you really need herbs over there?" The soldier didn't smile. "Sir, we need everything. Especially what lasts." As the truck backed up to his barn, Elias felt a strange mix of pride and helplessness. It wasn't guns or bullets he was sending, just jars of honey and sacks of dried herbs. He mumbled almost to himself. "Ain't no one ever won a war with herbal tea." But he was wrong. And in just 72 hours, 72 short hours, one of his stupid ideas, involving that very mixture, would help save a convoy of American soldiers pushing through occupied France. They called him a fool, a nobody. Just a sectarian farmer. Until his secret additive helped change the course of the war. Elias Stoltzfus was not a hero by any conventional standard. He was a farmer, an herbalist, and like many men in the Amish communities of Pennsylvania, he had never set foot outside his home county. Born in 1906, he inherited 140 acres of land from his father, along with an old barn, a row of beehives tucked beneath an apple orchard, and a small stone workshop where his grandfather had once prepared herbal remedies for the community. By 1935, Elias had turned that modest setup into something more. He managed over 280 bee colonies, that's roughly 16 million bees, and cultivated nearly 2 acres of medicinal herbs, wild ginseng, valerian root, yarrow, St. John's wort, and a rare strain of mountain mint his family had brought from Switzerland generations ago. He produced close to 2,400 pounds of honey each season, and dried enough herbs to fill 3 storage sheds. That made him one of the most productive herbalists in Lancaster County. But to the outside world, he was invisible. Then came 1941. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, the United States declared war, and everything, every person, every tool, every resource, was suddenly pulled into the orbit of the global conflict. Elias watched as his neighbors' sons, and then his own brother Isaac, went off to join the fight. Some enlisted. Others were drafted. Elias was 35 and had a weak lung from childhood pneumonia. He was classified as 4F, unfit for service. But more than that, he was Amish. His faith forbade him from taking up arms. Violence, in any form, went against everything he believed. That single classification, 4F and conscientious objector, haunted him. He wanted to serve. Instead, he was told to grow, to produce, to harvest. While others bled on the beaches of Normandy and in the jungles of Guadalcanal, Elias was asked to fill government quotas for wheat, corn, and vegetables. But it was his herbs, not his crops, that would eventually matter most. During the early years of the war, sugar became one of the most tightly rationed items in the United States. In 1942, the federal government instituted strict limits on consumer sugar consumption, just 24 pounds per person per year, down from nearly 100 before the war. Sugar was needed for everything, from preserving food to making explosives. So civilians turned to honey. And so did the military. Honey was shelf-stable, energy-dense, and naturally antimicrobial. It didn't spoil, didn't need refrigeration, and could be packed into small containers for frontline soldiers. The United States Army began looking for suppliers who could meet this growing demand. Elias's name showed up in a Department of Agriculture ledger in 1943 as a registered honey producer with surplus capacity. He got a letter in the mail offering a small government contract. Nothing flashy. Just deliver 600 pounds of honey to a processing facility in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It would be canned, labeled Army issue, and shipped off to wherever American boys were fighting. At first, Elias didn't think much of it. He loaded the jars, filled out the paperwork, and went back to tending his hives. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. The U.S. military wasn't just using honey as food. Quietly, field medics and logistics officers had begun experimenting with it in ways that hadn't been tested on a large scale before. Honey, they discovered, could be used in field dressings for wounds thanks to its antibacterial properties. Mixed with certain herbs, it could be formed into energy pastes that provided sustained stamina without the crash of refined sugar. And still, back on the farm, Elias had no idea. To him, the war was still distant. Letters from Isaac came less often. The ration books got thinner. The skies filled with the roar of passing aircraft. And still, the bees kept working. By the end of 1943, Elias had expanded his operation to 280 hives. That meant over 16 million bees under his care, producing enough honey to fill a small freight car. Yet he remained convinced that he was on the sidelines. He could not have known that his quiet work, deep in the heart of rural Pennsylvania, would soon collide head-on with one of the most audacious logistical experiments of the Second World War. All it would take was one moment, one idea, and a mixture so strange no one thought it could possibly work. By the spring of 1944, Elias Stoltzfus was producing more honey and herbs than any farmer in Lancaster County, close to 3,000 pounds of honey and nearly 800 pounds of dried medicinal plants. But while honey flowed from his hives, his frustration grew thicker with every shipment he sent out. The government didn't tell him where the jars went. No acknowledgement, no thanks, no proof it was helping. He'd load barrels into the back of army trucks that came with no faces, just gloved hands, clipped signatures, and the drone of an engine disappearing over the hill. "Feels like throwing it into the ocean," he told his neighbor, Samuel Beeler. "Can't even be sure it's reaching a soldier." His neighbors didn't make it any easier. "You still playing apothecary while the world burns?" one asked him at church. "Real men are fighting. You're just stirring honey," another muttered under his breath. "Heard the army's going to send you a medal made of beeswax." Elias pretended to smile, but the bitterness stuck. He'd lost 2 close friends to the draft, and his brother's last letter was dated December. It was now April. Each night he'd sit in silence, a hand on his worn Bible, reading that last letter over and over. Isaac had written, "We're cold, wet, sometimes hungry, but we move, always moving. The worst part isn't the bullets. It's the exhaustion. Men are falling asleep standing up. If you send anything, send something that keeps us awake." That line, "keeps us awake," burned itself into Elias's thoughts. So he started looking at his herbs differently. Not just as remedies for colds or aches, but as tools. His grandfather had once made a tonic from ginseng, valerian, and wild mint, a mixture used by travelers on long journeys. It was said to sharpen the senses, steady the nerves, and delay fatigue. What if he could refine it? What if he could make something stronger, something that could help soldiers stay alert, fight longer, think clearer? One evening, while working in his stone workshop, he dipped a cloth in a mixture of honey, ginseng extract, and crushed mountain mint. He rubbed it on a rusted hinge on his barn door. The squeals stopped instantly. But more than that, the mixture left a faint, cooling sensation on his hands, a tingling sharpness. He paused. Tested it again. The herbs weren't just soothing. They were stimulating. The next morning, a truck from the Harrisburg depot arrived early. Same uniform, same clipboard, but this time the corporal in charge looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, hands trembling slightly. "Last night we lost 8 men in the Ardennes," he said, not even realizing he'd let the location slip. "Lost?" Elias asked. "Exhaustion. Men were so tired they didn't hear the Germans coming. Fell asleep at their posts. We can't keep pushing them this hard without something to keep them sharp." Something clicked. Elias leaned forward. "I've got something." The corporal gave him a blank stare. I've got a compound. Made it myself. It's just honey, herbs, and extracts. Keeps you awake. Sharpens your senses. You want us to give soldiers herbal tea?" Elias didn't flinch. "Might save 8 men next time." The corporal laughed, hard. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." He expected to be mocked again, but instead the corporal paused, then said, "Fine. 1 crate. I'll take it to the boys at Fort Dix. See what they say." That night, Elias didn't sleep. Days passed, then weeks. No word. He went back to his hives, watching bees dance in tight spirals above the frames. Everything about them was precision, no waste, no ego, just function. He thought about how bees never sleep. How they work tirelessly, driven by instinct and chemistry. He muttered under his breath, "Those little creatures been doing this long before we figured it out." Then, on May 18th, a black military sedan pulled into his yard. 2 men stepped out. One wore a medic's armband. The other was in logistics. No uniforms, just brown coats and steel eyes. "We heard you've been mixing some things," the man in the coat said. Elias nodded. "We ran a field test," the other added. "On 12 men. Gave them your compound before a 36-hour forced march." "And?" Elias asked, barely breathing. "They stayed sharp. Alert. No crashes. One soldier said his vision felt clearer than it had in months." The man handed Elias a paper. "Effective immediately, you're authorized to produce 50 pounds of compound per month. Code name, Vigilance." Elias blinked. "Excuse me?" "Vigilance," the officer repeated. "Welcome to the war, Mr. Stoltzfus." In that moment, the bees outside didn't sound like bees anymore. They sounded like drums. He had just crossed an invisible line, from farmer to asset. And no one, not even Elias, understood yet just how far that stupid idea was about to go. By late May of 1944, Elias Stoltzfus was no longer just shipping honey. He was making war compound, 1 jar at a time. His stone workshop, once a quiet refuge for preparing herbal remedies, had transformed into a crude but relentless production line. Clay jars of raw honey stood beside bundles of dried ginseng root, valerian, yarrow, and mountain mint. The air inside was thick and sweet, almost intoxicating. Every surface glistened with sticky residue. Flies buzzed at the windows like prisoners. Elias didn't care. He had orders to fill. Each week, a military truck arrived from Fort Dix, New Jersey, to collect the compound, now labeled VC7, short for Vigilance Compound Number 7. The containers bore no other markings. No one in the military told Elias where it went, or how it was being used. But in the second week of June, he got a clue. A letter arrived, not from his brother, but from a Sergeant Benjamin Hackett, 42nd Logistics Division, European Theater of Operations. Handwritten. Short. "Your stuff works. Gave it to 9 men before a 48-hour patrol. They stayed sharp. Germans didn't see us coming. 2 enemy supply trucks destroyed. 0 American casualties. Tasted like dirt and honey. Keep it coming. Elias read the note twice, then folded it neatly and placed it inside a mason jar on his shelf, like a medal made of words. Still, he had questions. Would this hold up? Could herbs really make a difference? Or was this just one lucky fluke, the kind of story soldiers tell before the real bullets start flying? He started experimenting. Mixing new formulas. Adjusting ratios. One morning, while testing a thicker batch on himself, he noticed something strange. His hands tingled. His vision sharpened. Colors seemed brighter. Sounds became clearer, the buzz of bees, the rustle of wind through wheat, even the distant rumble of a tractor miles away. It wasn't just energy. It was clarity. Focus. Heightened awareness. He muttered to himself, "Lord, forgive me if this is wrong. But if it keeps them alive." So he sent a note back. To whomever this reaches, compound now enhances sensory perception. Try before night patrols or ambush operations. Also improves reaction time under stress. Use sparingly, effects last 12 to 18 hours. A week later, a reply came, this time typed. Tested your modifications on 16 men during night reconnaissance near Ken. Reaction time improved by estimated 20%. Visual acuity noticeably enhanced. One soldier reported he could see Germans moving in the hedgerows before they could be heard. Bravo! Enclosing authorization for increase to £150 per month. Prepared to ship to port of Southampton for pre-invasion outfitting. Southampton. Invasion. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. Elias knew what was coming. Everyone did. The Allies were going to hit Fortress Europe. The question was when and where. But now he realized, his compound wasn't just for patrols. It was part of something bigger. Something massive. On June 3rd, a courier truck arrived with crates and a set of instructions. Prepare 20 jars for transatlantic shipment. Label, class and medical supplies. Destination, confidential. No insignia, no rank. Just urgency. That night, as Elias sealed the last jar, he paused and looked out over the darkened fields. His bees were silent in their hives. No wind. No stars. Just the low, thudding echo of thunder to the west. Not a storm, but something heavier. The kind of sound that stays in your bones. He didn't know it yet, but those jars would land in Normandy within 10 days. And somewhere behind the lines, men would consume a farmer's stupid herbal mix before rolling into the most dangerous stretch of road in the war. What began as a barnyard experiment had just crossed the English Channel. Normandy. June 12, 1944. 6 days after D-Day. In the chaos of the French countryside, convoys of American trucks rumbled down cratered roads under cover of darkness. The hedgerows were thick. The enemy still dug in. German ambushes came fast and without warning. But something was different this time. According to Captain Lawrence Mercer, 29th Infantry Division, a series of soldiers who had consumed what medics called the Amish compound, had moved with unusual sharpness through an area near St. Miraglise, past what scouts called a death trap. We heard them before we saw them, Mercer would later write. Their eyes were sharper. Their reflexes faster. One private spotted a German sniper in a church tower 300 yards away, in the dark, before anyone else even heard movement. That sharpness had a name, Vigilance Compound Number 7, a sticky, dark honey herb mixture distributed in small metal tins. Field medics called it bee fuel. Infantry called it God's coffee. But whatever the nickname, it worked. Back in Pennsylvania, Elias Stoltzfus had no idea what was happening. He just kept producing, kept mixing, kept stirring. His hands were calloused from grinding herbs. His back ached from hauling barrels. But he didn't stop. Then on June 22nd, a military courier arrived with something unusual, a manila envelope, unmarked, containing a photograph. It was black and white, grainy, and torn along the edges. But it showed what mattered. An American squad of 8 men crouched behind hedgerows near Corentin. One soldier held up a small tin, grinning. Written in pencil on the back. "Your stuff. It saved us." That photo hit Elias harder than any letter. It meant his work, his bees, his barn, his prayers, was no longer just farm labor. It was now baked into the machinery of liberation. By July, the U.S. Army's Logistics Command authorized expansion of vigilance to a full dozen medical units. Over 300 pounds per week were being shipped overseas. British and Canadian forces began requesting the compound for their nighttime raids in Cannes and beyond. And still the secret held. The Germans noticed soldiers moving faster, reacting quicker. They blamed terrain, weather, luck. They didn't know that a pacifist farmer in Pennsylvania, a man who couldn't even hold a rifle, had invented a performance enhancer using nothing but nature. Then came the first real test. On the night of July 29th, Allied intelligence intercepted a German plan to ambush a key American resupply route near St. Lo. At least 3 divisions were depending on those trucks. If they were hit, entire frontline positions would be forced to retreat. A decision was made: deploy a full convoy, 62 trucks, with every soldier dosed with vigilance compound. The medics had only 4 hours to distribute the mixture. They worked with spoons, mess kits, even bare hands. The compound was thick, pungent, clinging to the tongue like medicinal syrup mixed with raw honey. At 0200 hours, the convoy moved. No headlights. No engine revs. Just motion, and men whose senses had been sharpened to an almost supernatural degree. German scouts didn't hear them. German mortars didn't fire. And by 0600, the entire supply run had completed without a single loss. Not one truck hit. Not one soldier wounded. The after-action report was brief. Enhanced sensory awareness preserved operational secrecy. Recommend continued use of compound VC7 in night convoys. For the first time in the European theater, a logistics miracle had occurred, and no one could explain it. But one man back in Pennsylvania had an idea. Because that same morning, he received another package. This one from his brother Isaac. Inside was a worn field jacket reeking of sweat and mud, and a note. "Your herbs got here before I did. I can see in the dark now, Eli. I can hear them coming. You're saving lives." Elias folded the note, held it against his chest, and sat down on the step outside his barn. He could smell the wax and honey in the air. But under it all, he could still smell the herbs, and they smelled like hope. August 20th, 1944. The Falaise Gap, northern France. For weeks, Allied forces had been pushing German troops eastward across Normandy. But what had started as a breakout was threatening to become a disaster, not for the Allies, but for the Germans. Nearly 50,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were trapped between 2 converging Allied armies. If they could be sealed in, the German line in France would collapse. If they escaped, the war in Europe would stretch on for months, maybe years. The Gap, just a 20-kilometer corridor of broken farmland and muddy roads, became a battlefield of desperation. American General Omar Bradley needed supplies to move faster than the enemy. Fuel, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, everything. And he needed men who could move without rest, who could stay sharp for 36 hours straight. Enter Convoy Echo 9. 142 trucks, 28 jeeps, 10 half-tracks, all loaded to the brim and scheduled to cross into the Falaise region under cover of night using unpaved farm roads, bridges barely wide enough for tractors, and paths surrounded by trees thick enough to swallow the moonlight. At 1900 hours, just before sunset, the motor pool commander made a call that would seem absurd in any other war. "Distribute the Stoltzfus compound. Full dosage." 3 dozen medics sprang into action. Metal tins marked VC7 were rolled out. The honey herb compound, sticky, heavy, and amber-brown in color, was spooned into mess kits, canteens, and sometimes straight into soldiers' mouths. The air smelled like burnt sugar and medicinal herbs. Inside one of the trucks sat Corporal Isaac Stoltzfus, 42nd Infantry Division. Elias's brother. He had no idea the compound being distributed to his unit came from the same hands that had taught him how to tend bees as a boy back in Lancaster County. He only knew what the officer said. "This stuff keeps you sharp. You don't sleep. You don't slow down. You see in the dark. You get there alive." By 22:30 hours, the convoy was ready. Engines turned over with soft purrs. No revving. No clanking gear changes. Just motion. The darkness was absolute, moonless, clouded, thick with fog. Headlights were banned. Radio's silence enforced. Only the stars, barely visible through the haze, knew the route. As the convoy moved, it passed within 800 meters, just over half a mile, of a German mortar unit hidden in the hedgerows near Trun. Scouts later confirmed that the Germans never reacted. No shells were fired. No spotlights triggered. They didn't know the Americans were there. But more than that, the American soldiers were different. Their pupils were dilated. Their breathing steady. Their minds sharp. One private later described it. "I could hear their boots in the mud before I saw them. I could smell their cigarettes from 200 yards away. Everything was louder, clearer, like someone had turned up the volume on the world." But silence wasn't invincibility. 10 miles into the route, as the trucks crossed a makeshift wooden bridge over the Dives River, a German reconnaissance patrol spotted movement. One flare went up, white then red. Then came the gunfire. The convoy split. Half the trucks pushed forward. The rest peeled off into a ravine below the ridge, trying to outflank the attackers. Inside one of the lead vehicles, Corporal Elias Stoltzfus manned a Browning .30 caliber machine gun. He shouted over the radio, "They see us now! Move!" But the surprise had bought precious seconds. Because the first 8 minutes of heightened awareness had gotten them farther than expected, just far enough to bypass the worst of the German kill zone. German shells screamed overhead but struck only the tail end of the formation. 2 trucks were hit. 6 men wounded. None killed. The rest, 138 vehicles, made it through. Over 80 tons of ammunition. 4,000 gallons of fuel. 2 entire field hospitals packed in crates. They arrived in time to reinforce the Canadian First Army, who slammed the doors shut on the Falaise Gap the following morning. That night, exhausted soldiers set up triage tents and reloaded artillery in silence. Someone lit a cigarette. The medic beside him said, "Careful. You smell like a damn apothecary. You'll catch fire." They laughed. It was the first laugh in days. The name Stoltzfus compound began circulating in official reports. Even General George S. Patton mentioned it in passing during a debrief. "Whatever voodoo they're putting in those men, keep doing it." But the real moment came not from a general, but from a letter. A week later, back in Pennsylvania, Elias Stoltzfus received a battered envelope with foreign stamps. Inside, a torn piece of canvas from a military tent and a scribbled note. "They used your stuff before the Gap. I stayed awake for 40 hours. I shot straight. Some didn't make it. But most of us did. Thank you, brother. Isaac." Elias stood in his kitchen for nearly an hour, staring at the note. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just nodded. Then he walked outside to the hives, opened one carefully, and whispered, "You did good, girls." It was all he could say. The bees kept working, unaware, unbothered, just doing what they always did, building, protecting, sustaining. Like Elias had done. Like his compound had done. A sweet, sharp clarity that had carried men through death, and into one more dawn. The war didn't end in Normandy. It thundered eastward across France, into Belgium, through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and finally into the shattered streets of Berlin. But for Elias Stoltzfus, his war, the part that belonged to him, ended on a quiet September morning in 1944 when the trucks stopped coming. No letter. No explanation. Just silence. The barrels were stacked. The compound was ready. But the army never returned to collect. Elias didn't ask questions. He didn't have to. He knew what it meant. His job was done. By the winter of 1944, Allied forces had broken the German defensive lines. Logistics had shifted. New performance compounds and synthetic stimulants were being developed in government labs with budgets 1,000 times what Elias had. There was no more need for an Amish farmer's herbal trick. But that didn't mean it hadn't mattered. In a post-war report by the United States Army Quartermaster Corps, buried between stats about truck tires and engine oil, there's a line that reads, "Temporary performance enhancer designated VC7 demonstrated minor but measurable improvement in sustained alertness and sensory acuity under limited field conditions. Source: Civilian Supplier, Pennsylvania." No medal. No citation. Just one sentence in a government document no one would read. But that was fine with Elias. He had never done it for glory. In the spring of 1945, as victory celebrations filled American cities with ticker tape and brass bands, Elias returned to what he'd always done. He repaired his barn. He repainted the bee boxes. He split his hives in preparation for a heavy clover bloom. And when Isaac finally returned home, thinner, quieter, with a shadow behind his eyes, they said almost nothing about the war. They just sat on the porch, drinking coffee, watching bees. Isaac said once, after a long silence, "I heard they tested your stuff on the Navy too." Elias smirked. "Well, hell. Maybe I sank a U-boat." They laughed. For real this time. Years passed. The compound was never made again. The formula lived only in Elias's head, a mix of instinct, trial and error, and the smell of Pennsylvania summers. In 1953, a government inspector visited Elias's property during a census survey of agricultural producers. At the end of a long form, the inspector asked, "Did your operation contribute to the war effort?" Elias paused. "In a way," he said. "I kept some folks awake." The inspector blinked. "You grew food?" "No," Elias answered. "I made them sharper." The inspector didn't write that down. By the 1960s, the barn was falling in on itself. The compound barrels rusted and empty. But the bees still worked, their hum unchanged. Their methods still perfect. They needed no thank you. And neither did Elias. He passed in 1971 at the age of 65. His obituary ran 4 lines in the Lancaster County Register. Elias W. Stoltzfus, lifelong farmer and herbalist, died Sunday at home. Survived by his brother Isaac. Known locally for his honey. No mention of Normandy. No mention of soldiers. But on his property, beneath a rusted gate, a child decades later would find a strange metal box with a cracked jar inside. Inside the jar, a folded note, stiff with age. It read, "Vigilance. Remember us." And maybe that's enough. Because sometimes the smallest contribution in the biggest war doesn't need to be remembered by the world, just by the men it saved. It's easy to think that history is made by generals and tanks, by grand strategies, famous speeches, and battles with names etched into monuments. But sometimes it's made by something humbler, like a man alone in a barn. Like a swarm of bees. Like a sticky golden substance mixed with ancient herbs that was never meant for war. Elias Stoltzfus never stormed a beach. He never fired a shot. But his compound, his so-called stupid herbal trick, rolled through the mud of Normandy. It crossed bridges under fire. It sharpened the senses of soldiers carrying wounded boys home. And it did something that almost nothing else in war ever does. It saved lives without taking any. There's something profoundly American, profoundly human in that idea. That in the middle of the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen, one man using the most ancient and natural resources on earth could tip the balance. Not with violence, but with ingenuity. A jar of honey and herbs became a weapon of clarity. And for just a moment, clarity was victory. So maybe it's worth asking, how many other small contributions have we forgotten? How many wars were nudged not by bullets but by ideas? By people who refused to accept "we can't" as the final answer? Elias's story didn't make the textbooks. His name doesn't appear on monuments. But his legacy didn't end in 1945. The principles behind his compound, the use of natural adaptogens to enhance human performance under extreme stress, became a quiet foundation for post-war research into alertness, vigilance, and battlefield medicine. In the Korean War, American medics distributed experimental stimulant compounds to soldiers on long patrols. Some of those formulas traced their conceptual roots back to what Elias proved in his stone workshop, that nature, properly understood, could help men endure beyond their limits. Even in the modern era, special operations units study the effects of natural compounds, ginseng, rhodiola, cordyceps, on reaction time, focus, and sustained performance. The science has advanced. The labs are sterile. The equipment is expensive. But the core idea? That came from a pacifist farmer who couldn't fire a gun but understood that war is won not just with firepower, but with clarity of mind. At the Lancaster County Historical Society in Pennsylvania, there's a small exhibit most visitors walk past without noticing. It's a glass case containing a worn metal tin, a handwritten note, and a faded photograph of a bearded man standing beside a row of beehives. The placard reads, Elias W. Stoltzfus, 1906 to 1971. Amish herbalist and beekeeper. Known locally for producing honey and medicinal compounds during World War II. Contributed to wartime logistics efforts through unspecified agricultural supply. His work remains largely undocumented. Inside the tin, if you look closely, there's still a trace of amber residue, sticky, fragrant, ancient. And beneath the photograph, someone carved 3 words into the wooden base. Vigilance. Remember us. No ceremony. No statue. Just a quiet acknowledgement from one generation of warriors to the man who helped them survive. They say history is written by the victors. But sometimes the most important parts are written in grease, not ink. In silence, not speeches. Elias Stoltzfus never fired a gun in combat. He never pulled GS in a dogfight or bailed out of a burning tank. But without him, a whole generation of soldiers might not have come home. He broke no rules, because he was never officially part of the system. He ignored no orders, because he was never given any. And in doing so, he saved lives. Not through force, but through focus. Not through orders, but through understanding. He saw a problem. And instead of waiting, he fixed it. That's not just herbalism. That's courage. Corporal Isaac Stoltzfus, the soldier we met earlier in this story, once gave an interview years after the war. He was older then, white hair, a quiet voice. But when he was asked who his hero was, he didn't name a general or another soldier. He said this: People talk about Medal of Honor winners. But the man who saved my life wore a black hat and never left the farm. I don't even know if he realized what he did. But I remember how sharp my mind was when I needed it most. He gave me clarity. And that gave me a chance to come home. There are thousands of stories like that from the war. Stories that were never told, or were nearly forgotten. Stories that remind us that victory isn't just about firepower or bravery on the battlefield. It's also about people like Elias. The ones who work quietly. Who solve problems. Who build things better, not because they're told to, but because it's right. Not all heroes fly. Not all heroes fight. Some of them kneel in a barn at dawn, mixing honey with herbs, thinking about the soldier who will carry that mixture into battle tomorrow. And thanks to Elias Stoltzfus, that soldier had a better chance of coming home. One man. One compound. One quiet act of creation. And from it, a ripple that would echo through generations.